There are people who looked up to God in extremely critical circumstances in the Bible. It is interesting to know that they have 5 common experiences that are vitally instructive for us today. Everyone from Genesis to Revelation that looked up to God in extremely critical condition have 5 critical and common experiences that I believe are vitally instructive for us today. Number 1, the security and safety of their lives were totally unpredictable. That was why they actually looked up to God. The security and safety of their lives were totally unpredictable. In all the cases, and especially the 3 specific cases that I will be sharing from next week, that is the case of Jehoshaphat, the case of Hezekiah, and the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it was obvious that they were a real problem. Humanly speaking, they were totally edged in by their enemies, and there was no way they could have survived. Number 2, their situation was urgent with a greater tendency for panic and confusion. They were face to face rather with death, and something must be done urgently to avert the imminent doom. In all the cases, number 3, the intimidation of their enemies was strong, was lethal, and real, and must never be taken for granted at all. Their enemies had numbers, their enemies had status, their enemies had credibility, their enemies had experience, their enemies had power, their enemies had advantage. By every human standard, in all the cases of those who critically look up to God in extremely critical conditions and circumstances, they appear to be up against an enemy that is stronger and more formidable than them, and they were fighting a battle they cannot possibly win. Number 4, their decision to look up to God was naturally risky, considering what they were up against. Their decision to look up to God was unreasonable and a reflection of their readiness to accept whatever may be the will of God. In fact, that they looked up to God in extremely critical circumstances showed that they had totally resigned to whatever may be the will of God for their life. It was an action of faith and trust, knowing that God will always have the best plan for their lives. They were ready to go with God, even if it means losing their lives. To them, it was better to lose their life in the process of committing themselves to the will of God than to try to do it all alone by their power, or to rely upon another alternative for salvation. It was indeed a courageous action of faith. They actually jumped from a dangerous cliff and restfully trusted in God throughout the fall, expecting Him to catch them before they hit the ground. They chose to put all their eggs in the basket of God. They willingly refused to have any alternative to God in the face of a highly tempting and seemingly hopeless situation. Number 5, in all the examples in the scripture of those who looked up to God in faith and trust in critical circumstances of life, it is gratifying to observe that God never disappointed them. All of them, from Genesis to Revelation, God never disappointed them. They looked up to God and their faces were brightened, were lightened. They were delivered from shame and discouragement. God never disappointed them. Their absolute dependence on God eventually paid off. God came for them at the nick of time. He proved Himself faithful, reliable, and dependable. He honored their faith and glorified Himself in their various situations and their various conditions. Brethren, let me say emphatically as I conclude today's broadcast that God is still the same today. What He did for them, He will do for you today if you dare to trust Him like they did, regardless of the hopelessness of your current condition. I believe that there are many lessons to learn from the faith of biblical characters who looked up to God and experienced His miraculous intervention.